What is identity? Yeah, I guess it's being.
So what makes you, you?
Oh my gosh, what makes me me? I definitely have a cultural sense of identity, but it's evolved quite a lot over time. I grew up amongst my siblings, who all pretty much look like me, but we're mixed race, Japanese and Italian, grew up in New York. And so my parents are our community was very mixed. So I grew up in Queens, so there were everyone across the street from us was a Chinese family. There was an Irish family next to us, a German family on the other side, Jewish kids, Irish kids, Italian kids, Jamaican kids. And actually, I think we connected through religion more. Like, it was more a separation of religion. Like, there were a lot of Catholics, so all the Catholics were together. So that definitely had an impact on me as the person I thought I was. Like, who am I? I'm just, I don't know, I've always felt a part of a whole, I guess. And that has changed quite a lot because I was raised in a very secure situation as far as identity, where I didn't have to think about who I was that much at all, except the loud sister, or the bossy one, or the creative one, or whatever. I had fortunately also 4 little brothers right under me, so I was basically like the boss of them, and so that kind of solidified my personality, I think, as just kind of like a group participant, but also they fostered in me a lot of creativity. Who am I? But yeah, I mean, that was all shaken up quite a lot when I got a little bit older. I ended up going to a school that was primarily white kids, upper middle class, and then to an upper class white girls' school in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I, for the first time, learned what the term minority meant. There were a couple girls who were from a Catholic girls' school in Harlem, where they had gone for elementary school and junior high, and then ended up coming to my high school, which was a 5-day boarding school in Greenwich, Connecticut. So there was a couple black girls and myself, and we were all the smart kids. So I remember in a class, a morality and social justice class, someone had mentioned to the teacher, how are we going to understand the plight of the poor when the only minorities we know are Tuere and Melissa. And Tuere and I were always like vying for first position in our class, so we were like in top 3 national percentile even. So I remember after class saying to Tuere, like, what does that mean, minority? Is it like because we're in the top class percentile? And she's like, no. She's like, where have you been your whole life, And just like the difference between growing up in my community and her growing up in Harlem, like hearing that all the time. Her father was a Black Panther, and so they were very, very involved in the cultural revolution of the 60s and 70s and the civil rights movement, whereas my parents, the crazy thing is, like, my dad's family as Italian Americans, went through their civil rights movement before that. People don't understand in the United States that Italian Americans were actually on the census listed as blacks until really quite recently. There's something that happens generationally that we forget about as Americans, I think because we have very short-term memory, that race or belonging has not always been the same generation to generation. So, wow, I'm taking a long time to get to. So my father definitely had this like experience, his own little inheritance from the civil rights push that his parents' generation had made, and as we discuss a lot at work also, like what makes you become part of the overculture, what makes you become part of the majority, and for our generation it's whiteness, right? Like we talk about being white, and so and in that sense being accepted as part of the majority. I think my dad definitely I think most of his experience outside of New York anyway was as a white American, but he didn't have those kind of color blinders on at all. I did not grow up at all with my parents talking about how they were different racially. They always talked about how they were different culturally. But my father's parents also were very, very accepting. And I think it's because back in Italy, before they immigrated to the States, they were not considered Italians by Italians. People don't understand that in Italy, up through World War I, there were 55 different languages. There were a lot of people that had, through conquest, come to Italy. And my grandfather's family was from a very small group in the mountains in the north. So they were just very smart, open-minded, creative people. And that is kind of what made me to begin with. And then I had this little upheaval. I've had stranger, further upheaval because I went to a school of predominantly white students in New Mexico, where the native people actually took me in as a native friend or ally. And so I kind of was part of both of these communities that didn't really intersect in New Mexico. But through living there and other work, I came to work at the Smithsonian, and now I'm the film programmer at the National Museum of the American Indian. And I guess the last shaking of my world is working there and not being a Native American, but looking like one. So that has been a mind blow for me. How people want to, I don't know. People, again, they want to label you or give you an identity based on their own experience rather than your experience. But, even being in the Native community, more and more, I've realized that it's a mindset, it's a philosophy. Who I am as a person is my way of really interacting with other people. I'm constantly having, Native scholars tell me, oh, it's so funny, you look like a Native person, you think like a Native person. And I'm like, well, that was an education. I fortunately had very smart people around me. And there's this great Native American poet and activist named John Trudell, and he says the big problem is we're all Native people. Many of us have forgotten where we came from, and I think that is one of the things that I have learned and been able to recognize in myself, is that I am a person of this place and of this time and of this culture and community, and I am a native of that. We talk about kids who are native computer users, or it's a way of thinking.
So how do you think your definition of identity has changed from when you were a little kid to now?
How has my definition of identity? I think my definition of identity has changed because early on it always reflected back on my parents, I think, and my grandparents. My grandparents were around a lot. The funny thing is, so my mom's parents still lived in Japan. They still do. Her mother does. And she would visit, and she got along very, very well with my Italian grandparents. They were best friends. Like, they really, my Japanese grandmother still talks about my Italian grandparents very fondly. And her 88th birthday is coming up, and she wants to go to their house in Montauk, where we used to spend our summers. I have this sense, like, it's funny, like now at my age, especially, like I talk a lot with my friend. I'm 38, and people think I'm younger. But my siblings, I have 7 siblings, and they're baby makers, and I just see these little kids, and they're just so amazing, and they're super mixed, they're mutts. But they still identify with some things in particular, like a lot of them learning Japanese. And I'm like, wow, this little blonde-haired, blue-eyed Japanese-ish kid somewhere deep down that looks Irish really is speaking to me in 20s, like it's kind of weird and crazy and fun. I think my identity as a child came from my grandparents. Like, I saw parts of them that I wanted to be and could early on recognize those things in myself, like wanting to garden with my grandfather a lot or things like that. It was definitely a reflection. My identity was a reflection of them, I think. Now, I see my nieces and nephews, and maybe my definition of who I am is a reflecting back from them. I have this weird notion that, like, talking about like having my own kids or whatever, like, and how it's getting a little too late maybe for me to think about that. I think that I have inherited some kind of inquiry about life from my parents and grandparents. I definitely see it in my mother and her mother. Like, they have a question about life. I don't know what